And joining Dar will be attorney, author, and CPA Greg Rogers, who wrote the seminal book, Financial Reporting of Environmental Liabilities and Risks. So that should be a really, really interesting conversation. If you've never seen Dar Jamal, he's pretty remarkable guy. You can pre-register for either of these zoominars by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and hovering over the Actions and Events menu in the homepage menu bar, and you'll see Retake Zoominar Series, and just click on that and all the information and links are there. As to the forum process today, we have prepared 8 questions, and as each question is asked, it will be placed in the chat menu. Each response is limited to 2 minutes for each candidate. I may then ask a follow-up question or just allow each candidate an extra minute to amplify on their response or counter the other candidate's response. Taking into consideration all of that, with 1 minute to frame each question, that's about 7 or 8 minutes per question times 8 questions, so that's going to take an hour. We will time each candidate's response and post a 30-second sign on the screen, and then a bell will signify when time is up. We will give candidates 5 to 10 seconds to finish their sentence, but then we'll move on and mute the mic.
Right, so part of what we're going to do to help you, I mean, if you keep your eyes on the screen, panelists, is I will put this, can you see that? And we're
Yes, boy, can I see it.
It's not backwards. That's your 30-second warning, and then you'll hear the bell when your 2 minutes are up.
And we're not going to, we'll give you maybe 5 or 10 seconds to finish up, but after that, we're going to mute the mic, because we've all been to the one panel or another where, one or more speakers just go an extra 10 or 20 or 30 seconds every question, and that's just not fair. So we will cut. And now Roxanne's going to go over how the Zoom webinar process works.
Okay, looks like we have 34 people on. That's great.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that some people may not be familiar with Zoom, and so we're just going to go over a couple of things. And we are using the webinar format of Zoom right now, so we cannot see any of the participants, and you can only see the panelists, and you can probably see a little square that says Saraswati's name in it. She's going to be answering any questions or issues you have through the chat function, or if you want to make a comment to the whole group, you can do that through chat. But for questions to the panelists, we're going to use the Q&A function. So just to let you know, the chat function is, you'll find a little icon on the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it right now, then you want to hover your cursor down near the bottom and you'll see chat. And that's where you can type in an issue or a comment. But if you want to ask a question to one of the panelists, you're going to use the Q&A function, and that's also at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to hover down there and see that. So whenever you're ready, you can just use that Q&A function. We are not going to be monitoring that throughout the meeting, because we're going to let the 2 candidates answer the prepared questions, and then during the last half hour of the event, we're going to go to the questions that you've put in to the Q&A. So let me see if there's anything else we went over. Oh, and please don't use the raise your hand function, because we can't monitor that while we're doing this either. And just know that you're automatically muted. And I think that's about it. And if you have any questions about any of those functions, you can type them into chat, and Saraswati will answer your questions.
Okay, so we're ready to go. Just before you folks started joining the Zoominar, we had a virtual coin toss. Joe won and elected to go second on the first question, and then we'll rotate thereafter. So here is the first question. Can each of you tell us why you are running for the PRC and why you are the best candidate to become a PRC commissioner?
Yes.
Brian?
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Yes, I'm running because I believe that the PRC is an essential function in our government for making sure that we can transition to a green economy. The PRC is a vast unsung agency that has enormous implications for New Mexicans. We set rates for utilities and we attempt to regulate telecommunications. And right now, with the changes coming to the networks, with the real technological breakthroughs that we're seeing in renewable energy, transitioning the electric network to a renewable network is going to take a lot of challenge. And I love those kinds of challenges. I've spent 13 years at the PRC in various capacities as an advocate, as an advisor, as a witness for telecommunications. And I've seen what impact it can make. I've also seen, since it was created in 1999, and it's become more and more politicized as the years go by. And I would like to stop that process. I would like to re-enshrine expertise, re-enshrine respect for the process and for the facts, and use that to make good decisions. PRC commissioners are quasi-judicial decision makers for the most part. They have other duties as well. But it's such an important agency, and I have the experience and the background. I thought it's important that they have somebody in the commission who understands the process and knows how to get things done there.
Okay, well, you must have had your clock on because that's about exactly 2 minutes. Joe, you're up.
Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you Retake Democracy for hosting this forum. We're dealing with very different circumstances these days. I want to take the first question of why I'm the best candidate. I'm the best candidate because this is an elected position. I have over 30 years of experience in federal civil service. I'm a licensed professional engineer in the states of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. I've been an elected official for 14 years, so I know what it means to work with other elected officials on a governing body. I'm a former mayor of Espanola. I understand the importance of having a competent executive team and frontline team. And I've also been the former Santa Fe City Councilor, and I've got a real strong progressive record of getting things done and a good progressive record of reform. I'm also the best candidate because I'm publicly financed. I'm not going to be beholden to any special interests. And I think that speaks volumes, and we know that there are a lot of special interests in the PRC. I'm running to make a difference. I've dedicated my whole life to public service. We all know that the PRC is in need of reform. I want to get in there and reform not just the organization, but the regulatory process to make sure that it's much more efficient. I want to make sure that we're adequately facilitating the implementation of the Energy Transition Act. The goal has been set to be carbon free by 2045, but we still need to build that path to achieve that goal. Some of the things that need to be done, we need to modernize the grid. We need to electrify our transportation vehicles. And so there's work to be done, and I'm up for it. I can hit the ground running, and I bring a fresh perspective to the PRC, an outside fresh perspective that's experienced and qualified with a lot of leadership experience to make a big difference.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. All right, so the second question, and this will be Joe again because we're rotating who goes first.
I'm sorry, isn't there a chance a minute at the end of
Oh,
each
that's right. I'm sorry. Yes, I'm losing the rules. It's 1 minute for you, and then back to Joe.
You know, what's interesting is on the surface, me and Joe do have a very similar resume. I've also got many years federal experience. I worked in DC for about 10 years. I've worked in New Mexico in state government for about 20 years. I was an assistant attorney general where I appeared as a ratepayer advocate for a decade in front of the commission. And so I really understand what it means to be in the trenches, making arguments, marshaling evidence, and presenting that to the PRC. And I understand the ratepayer interest in this case. And the ratepayer interest is not just one thing. It's a myriad of things. We all want to breathe fresh air. We all want to pay the least amount possible for electricity. And we all want to have a clean world that we can pass on to future generations. I'm very cognizant of that. I know the process of the PRC inside and out. That's not what's broken. The process is not broken. And I think what's broken is the overt politicalization of the agency and a misunderstanding of what commissioners can and cannot do. I will bring that understanding to the commission.
Thank you very much, Brian.
Can you guys hear that tone?
Not very well, but I can hear it.
Okay, I'll try to turn it up. And can I ask you, Brian, to move your screen forward a little bit so we see a bunch of your ceiling instead of you. Okay. Oh, better.
I forgot my mixing spoon to prop up my camera.
Oh, okay. Well, whatever you need to do to make it work.
How's this?
That's a lot better. Thank you.
All right, Joe, you got a minute.
Okay. Let me expand on my experience. I've worked at all levels of the federal government, division, office level, regional level, and I worked in Washington, D.C. As an elected official, having served on these governing bodies, as you know, some of you know, they operate as quasi-judicial bodies. They hear appeals on decisions from lower level entities. And so I understand what a quasi-judicial proceeding is. I understand ex parte communications. And I think the last thing I'll talk about is maybe the politicization of the PRC. It's ironic that my opponent is entering this race to depoliticize it when two sitting commissioners are encouraging him to run to get a majority vote. And so at least my perception is it's the perpetuation of factional politics on the PRC. And I see this as disingenuous.
Okay, thank you.
Can we just say something for a second for people who are just now tuning in? And also for the recording, we neglected to turn the recording on until just about 30 seconds ago. So if you're tuning in to watch the recording in the future, just know you missed just about the first, 6 or 7 minutes of it, and we apologize for that. We'll get better at this as we go along. And again, we're going to type your questions into Q&A, but if you have a technical issue or something else, you can use the chat function, and Saraswati will try to help you.
Okay, so here's the next question. Next question is, and this is for you, Joe. You have some goals for what you might want to accomplish as a commissioner. So what would be your absolute highest priority as a commissioner?
Well, my highest priority would be to bring all these cooperating entities together. I think we've seen a lot of acrimony. I want to bring the executive, the legislative branches, and the Attorney General together to work with the PRC, to work on a continuous improvement process of how our regulations are working, what needs to be changed, how can we collectively address some of the needs on the PRC. One of my goals is to really create a more robust process to advocate for ratepayers. As we know, as many of you may know, the Attorney General has that primary public advocacy function. I don't see that happening. And so I want to improve that. I want to be a fighter for the ratepayers, with understanding that by law we have to consider, other interests as well. I want to do my part, as I mentioned before, to facilitate the full implementation of the ETA. I'm sure we'll get into the securitization of the San Juan Generating Station and the replacement resources and the financing order, but there's still more work that needs to be done with regard to replacement energy. I think that the organizational structure can be streamlined. House Bill 11, I think, made an attempt to reorganize it. One of my goals is to reorganize it administratively without the need for any state legislation. There's also some work that needs to be done with respect to ramping the PRC up to respond to a lot of the state legislation that supports building that path to a carbon-free energy future, like grid modernization. And I want to make sure that we're up to that task, whether it's providing expertise and advice to the commission, whether it's having enough FTEs. And lastly, my last goal, I think it's critical. As you know, the PRC depends on the Legislative Finance Committee. I want to make sure that the PRC is fully funded.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, Brian, your turn.
And if
I think my primary goal, and I do have more than one goal, but you only asked about one. The primary goal is to have our electric network meet or exceed the standards set in the ETA. At the end of 8 years, I want to see New Mexico's electric generation well on the way to being completely decarbonized. Now, there's a lot of intermediate steps along the way. And I'd also invite us all to think about what impact these networks have on our lives. Both the telecommunications and the electric network, they touch every aspect of our life, and we do it without even thinking. And I would like to be able to continue doing that. I would like the electric network to be an afterthought for most people. They flick the switch, they pay their bill, and they move on. So what I want to see is extensive distributed energy resources, both solar, including solar, wind, hydro, not hydrothermal, geothermal and biomass on the grid in New Mexico, presenting distributed energy generation to every New Mexican. It's an ambitious goal, but it's very doable. And I want to see more renewable energy manufacturers coming into the state and working. For that to happen, they need a fair degree of regulatory certainty, confidence in the process. And I will be working hard to establish that so we can pave the way for increased investments in renewable energy and more manufacturing jobs, building the infrastructure we need.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Joe, your turn.
Yeah, in terms of my 1 minute rebuttal, I think there are other larger forces at play, like the very market that New Mexico is in. We are in a traditionally regulated market. We're dealing with these vertically integrated utilities that handle everything from power generation to, residential and commercial distribution. And so there are other things that need to be done to deregulate the market, to create more competition, and that more competition means saving money for ratepayers. And I think that's a broader issue that we can address, but you can't just flick a switch and open up the market. We saw what happened with community solar. Another one of my goals, all the investor-owned utilities and the co-ops opposed community solar. And that is a consequence of the market that we're in this traditionally regulated market. These investor-owned utilities that are vertically integrated are less likely to share ownership of renewable energy projects. So there's broader issues at play, and I think that I can chew gum and walk at the same time, and I think that addressing our market restrictions and limitations will help.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. All right, one last minute for you, Brian.
It's important to understand that in District 3, which is the district we're running for, a lot of the utilities are not vertically integrated. We have electric co-ops that import their energy from other sources and that serve as basically distribution networks. So, it's important to have a really detailed understanding of how the industry works in District 3 to be able to move forward to meeting the goals of the ETA. And while competition might be worthwhile in some sectors of the electric generation, it's something that needs to be looked at very carefully. We had experience deregulating telecom in the 90s. It's had mixed results. We learned a lot of lessons from that, and I would apply those lessons to looking at how to deregulate aspects of generation on the electric grid.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. We've got our Third question coming up here. What do you see, and this one will be for you.
Sorry.
This one will be for you, Brian. What do you see as the biggest challenge to serving on the PRC, and how would you work to overcome that challenge?
Well, I'm not a professional politician. This is my first election, and I got to say, it's quite a challenge. Most of my jobs have been a series of interviews with people who understood the job and understood my capabilities. Running for an election is quite a different experience, especially when I'm doing most of it sitting at my kitchen table. So, that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that I'm facing right now. I'm very comfortable with the PRC and what they do and the industries that they regulate. They regulate a wide variety of industries. So I don't really see that as a burden. But getting my experience, getting my expertise, getting word of that, and having people understand the importance of that in this complicated area, I think is certainly one of the biggest hurdles I'm facing in this process. There's been some really wonderful aspects to it. I call people up. When I was canvassing for signatures, I had some great interactions, and I met some very thoughtful people who are engaged in these issues. And that has been one of the real high points of this process. So, in 3 weeks, I was able to collect almost 3,000 signatures. I think that's a pretty good accomplishment. And yeah, I think getting elected is the biggest burden to becoming a commissioner.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Brian. Joe, you've got 2 minutes.
Well, I thought the question assumes that we're already in office, so I'll take it like that. I think some of the challenges in serving on the PRC is really overcoming, I think, a lot of the historical baggage from the past. And I think we need to overcome that. We need to look forward. And if the Energy Transition Act is not getting us to look forward, I don't know what will. And the only way to overcome that is to make sound decisions. I'm an engineer. I immerse myself in my decisions. Whenever I step onto the dais in any capacity on a governing body, whether I'm a mayor or a city councilor, I am prepared. And that's the way you kind of overcome this baggage, by showing the ratepayers and the voters and the public at large that we're thorough, we're competent, we're compassionate, and we're following the law. And I think that's very, very important. Some of the other things that I mentioned in terms of challenges is funding. The PRC is a pass-through for funding. It brings in over $100 million in revenue, yet its budget seems to hover around 14 or 15 million. This is unacceptable. This organization needs to be a model regulatory organization in the state, and funding is a primary issue that holds this organization back. So the reason for the PRC's, I think, maybe failings or perceived failings is the lack of funding. How am I going to overcome that? I'm going to work with the Legislative Finance Committee. I'm going to work with the governor. I'm going to work with the Attorney General and get him more involved in these cases. This is a round table, a circular table. No more polarization. I'm going to bring in a new era of tact and diplomacy and really think large in terms of addressing this issue and making the PRC a model organization.
Okay, Brian, you get another minute to address this largest challenge.
One of the most important things for any judicial or quasi-judicial decision maker to do is jettison the baggage they may or may not bring to a case. Parties come before a case. I call them parties or interveners. Others may call them special interests. But these are people and entities with a lot at stake in a PRC proceeding. And so the most important thing is making sure they get a fair process and a fair hearing. If you don't do that, that's one of the main grounds that parties have to take the party to the Supreme Court. The PRC has been appealed too many times to the Supreme Court because they don't understand the process and they don't follow it. So I can change that based on my background and based on my experience.
Thank you very much, Brian. Joe, you've got 1 more minute.
Yeah, I guess, if we want to revisit the challenges right now as candidates, yeah, I mean, under these conditions, without the benefit of interacting directly with voters, it's very challenging, but, we have to adapt. And I'm proud to say that I was able to collect almost $355 contributions to qualify for public financing, because there are too many regulated special interests involved in the PRC. And I'm not going to be beholden to any special interest, to any lobbyist. And so, so that is a challenge, and I overcame it by seeking public financing. As candidates as well, I think we need to be very honest with ratepayers. I'm a known quantity. I have not just the technical experience, but the qualifications and elected experience to hit the ground running. And lastly, this is a partisan elected position. I have been extremely active in the Democratic Party. I'm a Central Committee member. I'm the immediate past vice chair of the Santa Fe County Democratic Party. So that's important. And that's what I bring to the table.
Okay, thank you, Joe. We're on to our 4th question, and the softball questions are over. The Energy Transition Act, this is for you first, Joe. The Energy Transition Act, passed during the 2019 legislative session, has apparently severely limited the ability of the PRC to review, regulate, or revise P&M cost estimates for closing the San Juan generating station. This was the view of the PRC hearing examiners. There are some who feel this precedent could be applied to future full cost reimbursement from ratepayers for decommissioning and for the stranded assets costs for Palo Verde nuclear investments and for any gas plant. Do you feel the ETA limits the PRC's ability to regulate utilities and its ability to protect ratepayers from these costs? And if so, as a commissioner, would you support legal and legislative efforts to address that constraint?
Well, look, the Energy Transition Act, we know was very controversial after it was passed, but the Supreme Court ultimately ruled it is the law of the land, and it's a large piece of legislation. It amends the Public Utility Act. It amends the Air Quality Act. It calls for much more aggressive renewable portfolio standards. But the big issue is abandonment of coal plants that generate more than 300 megawatts. That is, I think, the issue that you speak of. Yes, if you look at the immediate past case of the closure of units 2 and 3, I think PNM only recovered 50% of its stranded costs. And ETA basically guarantees 100% recovery of stranded costs, not profits. And the PRC is kind of relegated to basically ensuring that the request to float securitization bonds is in order. And that is the finance order, which has been basically adopted with the resolution of the abandonment case. So it's just very difficult. And I wouldn't support any legislation to overturn it. I want us to heal and work together with the governor and with the legislature. But as a commissioner, I will guard against any kind of escalation and of removing the usurping of the PRC's ability to review these abandonment cases for other facilities. So, I think, yes, it is a precedent, but I will make sure that it doesn't escalate and expand to other facilities.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Brian, same question.
Thank you. The ETA was a massive bill. It was almost 90 pages long, and it made some pretty sweeping changes to what the PRC does. And yes, it did eliminate some discretion for the PRC, and I do have concerns for that. Recently, New Energy Economy has taken the PRC to the Supreme Court yet again, based on the 11 lines in the bill. That's about a quarter of a page out of 90 pages that that NEE had problems with, and that eliminated PRC discretion for securitizing these coal plants closing. But we do want the coal plants to close. We do want carbon-producing resource generation off of the grid. We want that as soon as possible. And the ETA was a way to streamline that process. You've also got to look at some of the legislative history for other bills concerning the PRC. The Constitution says the PRC shall regulate. I just got a poll. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Just close that window. Sorry, Brian.
Okay, I hope this doesn't cut into my time.
No. We'll give you an extra 10 or 15 seconds. Sorry about that.
You know, the ETA is not the first bill to cut into the PRC's discretion. And I think it's worth asking, why does the Roundhouse need to keep chipping away at the PRC's discretion? It's because the PRC hasn't been performing as it needed to. It's because it's become overly politicized. And to me, that's an argument not for a professional politician, but for somebody who understands the process and has been steeped in. As a government attorney for almost 30 years, I'm not beholden to special interests either. I'm not going to prejudge any legislative proposals that come before me. Once I'm elected, there will be legislative proposals. I will look at each and every one and give the party proposing them a fair hearing as to whether or not the PRC should go to the Roundhouse and support or oppose a particular bill. It's really got to be fit into a context. So I can't really say right now I would oppose or support any legislation. It really is a case-by-case basis.
Thanks. Sorry, I was trying to give you extra time so my bell didn't go off. But you got an extra 15 seconds.
All right, Joe, I want to return with a follow-up to your question. Do you feel that the ETA curtails the authority of the PRC, and how would you address that?
Well, yeah, it obviously does curtail the authority, and I think I've mentioned the immediate past case of the closure of units 2 and 3 for the San Juan Generating Station. But I will say that the writing was on the wall for coal plants. I think the ETA was maybe the nail in the coffin. We saw economic factors at play where partners in the ownership of the plant were bailing. When the regional haze requirement, came into effect, they had to install some equipment to reduce the emissions. The cost of coal is much more expensive relative to renewable energy. So I think the ETA just kind of formalized and set new emission standards that cannot be met by any existing coal plants. It set New Mexico as a leader across the country in a transition to clean energy. And so I think there are many, many good things in there. But I think as a commissioner, I'm going to be as judicious and prepared in rate cases and be thorough to assert the PRC's authority.
Okay, thank you, Joe. 1 minute, Brian.
Coal is dying, and it's not because of the ETA. It's because it's become an uneconomic proposition. What the ETA is doing is making sure that San Juan is not replaced by lesser polluting but still polluting gas-fired turbines. So we want to try to cut the use of that down. And in 2013, PNM started talking about shutting down San Juan, and that's when the shareholders started getting a little nervous about what was going to happen to their stranded investment. They were hoping for many more decades of productive use of San Juan, but coal is just not an economic proposition now. And that's a really good piece of news for everybody, because it really is driving a quicker transition to clean, renewable energy.
I was a little late on the 30 seconds there, so thank you for finishing
Brian.
up.
All right.
I just wanted to remind everybody who's on the call that if you have questions for the panelists, to put them into the Q&A function rather than the chat. And the Q&A is at the bottom of your screen, you know, same spot, same menu at the bottom where the chat function is. And then in about 20-25 minutes from now, we'll go through those questions and we'll ask them of the panelists.
Okay. This is the next question. PNM has proposed a 7-unit natural gas power plant, and this is for Brian first, power plant as its power replacement plan. Other states rejected development of natural gas plants because of less expensive renewable plus storage alternatives. The inevitability of unnecessary stranded assets was another factor, and the high costs of unnecessary capital improvements to develop the gas plants. For example, Arizona declared a moratorium on all new gas plant development. What is your position on whether new natural gas plants should be part of any power replacement plans?
Okay, this is really awesome because it's only happened in the last 2 days, but there's been 2 developments in renewable technology. One is flow batteries. They have found a way to manufacture utility scale flow batteries using non-toxic materials. Previously, you had to use vanadium to make a flow battery. So that's one thing. Another thing, researchers announced today, it's in the journal Nature, a new efficiency in solar panels using new techniques and new materials that increase the efficiency from around 33% to almost as high as 50%. So these are just 2 technological breakthroughs that are really going to drive the obsolescence of gas turbines. I agree with the Arizona decision that we don't need to be building more of these polluting infrastructure monstrosities. We need to be really focusing on the renewables. And so we're going to see continuing costs fall. Storage, the price is coming down precipitously. And I got to say, my hat's off to Kit Carson Co-op up in Taos. They are aggressively pursuing this. And it's a fantastic thing because they are going to reach energy or generation independence much quicker because of that. So I want to be careful also, though, about talking too much about specific cases. My boss, Steve Fishman, when I was advising him, and I'm proud of that, by the way. I'm proud that both Commissioners Hall and Fishman want me on their team to push renewables. I just, you know, I forgot what the question was. Gas turbines. Yeah, to the extent they produce carbon, I don't think they have a place on New Mexico's grid. The PRC needs to think in terms of decades. These gas turbines can last for decades, but given the volatility of oil prices, it's really low right now, but 8 months from now, it may be really high. I think we need to get it off the grid.
Thank you. Thank you. Joe, same question, 2 minutes.
Thanks for the question. Well, you know, the PRC just ruled on the replacement resources for the San Juan generating plant. And, you know, during that case, it was a whole number of scenarios that were advocated for. The primary scenario 1 that PNM was advocating included natural gas generation. We know that natural gas emits about half the greenhouse gas emissions as coal. So it's not good. And it's not a part, I think, of our plan to be carbon-free by 2050. And that's why those hearing examiners only recommended 2 elements most favored by the interveners, and they were both hybrid solar and battery storage facilities for a total of about 410 megawatts. And so there's still a little more that needs to be identified in terms of replacement resources, but we're already getting indications that natural gas is not ideal for where we want to go as a state. Now, there's another legal standard that's still going to be in question and could be subject to challenge, and that is the provision in the Energy Transition Act that requires replacement resources be located in the central consolidated school district in the Four Corners area. And that is where the two gas plants, the Piñon gas and the San Juan, the Piñon gas and the San Juan plant were proposed to be located by PNM. So this is still a very fluid situation. I don't support more natural gas. Yes, it gives that rapid response for needed reserve energy, but so does battery storage. And so we need to really push more battery storage to give us that quick start capability in this replacement portfolio. And hopefully with technology, we can be able to store more energy and avoid any natural gas.
Okay, thank you, Joe. 1 minute from you, Brian.
It's my understanding that the San Juan region is actually not that abundant in renewable energy resources. Its proximity to the San Juan Mountains makes it problematic for wind farms, and for the same reason problematic for solar farms in terms of cloud cover. So there's going to be a challenge siting replacement facilities in the San Juan area. It's an essential element, though, of helping the people injured by the closure of the coal plant recover. It's also, ex parte rules are something used at the commission a lot. And so candidates have to be careful about committing to one course of action or another without having fully examined the record, because that does open us up to allegations of bias and prejudice, which is a serious thing for a quasi-judicial decision maker. But as an overall proposition, I don't think natural gas is going to be around to generate electricity much longer. It's just not economic, and it doesn't make sense if we want to have clean air to breathe.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Joe, you get to finish on this one.
Well, it's unfortunate that so far the replacement resources that have been approved and bifurcated, as I said, they still need to identify additional replacement resources to make up for the San Juan generating station's capacity. But my hope is that the economic mitigation package of funding in the ETA will really help transition the area away from the coal plant, the coal mine. But I think I'd like to follow up and maybe get the Bureau of Business and Economic Research to actually do a more in-depth study on the anticipated economic impact on the closure of that coal plant. And on the heels of this one is going to be the Four Corners plant. So there's going to be a lot more discussion about the closure of coal plants, not just the San Juan generating station.
It's time. Thank you, Joe. We're on to question number 6. And I think the attempts for us using like dings and stuff like that aren't working very well because it's hard for people to hear. So I'm just going to say time when it's time, and then you can, finish up your sentence.
The 30-second paper mark in front of the camera has been helpful to me.
Okay.
Yeah, me too.
With the here's question number 6, and Joe goes first. With the retirement of San Juan, the continued reduction in the cost of renewable energy, and the improvement in efficiency and cost of storage, we're at a crossroad. Do you favor a shift from large centralized energy generation with the requirement of expensive generating stations and large distribution networks, or would you like to see New Mexico move toward a more decentralized energy system with more local controls over energy generation? And this one goes to Joe first.
Well, I think at the outset, I mentioned that most of New Mexico is in a traditionally regulated market, and it's very difficult to expand renewable energy projects. There's no competition to ensure that rates are kept low for consumers, and so I think we have to deal with the market. How can we enter a competitive market like the Western Imbalance energy market? I think that that's something that's worthy of a lot of study to see if we can do that. I think we've seen the legislature take some steps to try and kind of decentralize power generation by creating these energy districts that gives them the power to levy dedicated gross receipts taxes. So I think we're already seeing the legislature put down some markers that they're not happy with a large, centralized generation and a lack of competition. So I think the writing's already on the wall. And I as a commissioner, I would like to, look into see how we can further influence the market that we're in and transform it from a traditionally regulated market to a more competitive market, more decentralized competitive market. And that, that applies to the grid as well. We all know that central and eastern New Mexico has a lot of wind energy, but it's sparse in population and it's sparse in terms of the grid. And we need to give independent power producers the opportunity to interconnect with some of the existing grid to bring renewable energy to the market. But there's a lot of parochial positions. For example, Tri-State won't let independent power producers interconnect unless they charge an exorbitant fee. So I think we're on our way, and I'm for a decentralized competitive market.
Thank you, Joe. Brian, your turn.
I think this question really goes to the heart of what commissioners need to do. I think there's also no doubt that both the market and technology are driving the grid to more decentralized power generation. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, we have everything from solar panels on the rooftop in residential settings to larger solar farms, wind farms. There's a geothermal plant in southern New Mexico right near the Boot Heel. So it's happening, and it's happening pretty quickly, especially in utility terms, and that's an exciting thing. But you have to balance the interests in doing that. As a general proposition, I agree that localized, decentralized, it sounds really good and it's generally better. But there are safety concerns with electricity. There are reliability concerns with electricity. And some of these things are what impeded the community solar bill from passing last session. I think these can be addressed. And so in balancing the interests with respect to this question, we really need to look at what is the right size for New Mexico's grid. What is the most excellent ownership structure? Maybe divestiture of generation resources for the IOUs is the best thing. But if you thought the fight over the ETA was vicious, wait till you see this fight. So competition is not something you can write into the law. It's something you have to really understand and be able to incentivize that. So yes, decentralization and localization is a good thing as a general proposition, but it has to be done right. It has to be done in a way that protects everybody's interests.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Joe?
Yeah, I wanted to say a few words about energy efficiency programs. If you think about, managing the demand side of resources, one of the lowest cost alternatives is energy efficiency programs. Getting ratepayers to conserve. But right now, the current traditional rate structure is based on sales. Rates are set to address fixed costs, to pay for fixed costs, but consumption and sales varies. And so I want to push through decoupling. In 2019, the legislature passed a law that allows a mechanism to decouple utility profits from total sales. And that way it removes the incentive to sell more energy. And this would pave the way for more energy efficiency programs being paid for by utilities. And the last thing I'll say is, also in 2019, the legislature passed a bill calling for the study of hybrid microgrids. I think this is very important. I mean, we need a grid system that can accommodate a mix of renewable energy And I think the hybrid microgrids are part of the new frontier.
Okay, thank you, Joe. You've got 1 minute, Brian, and then we'll go on to the next question.
Well, the decoupling fits under the broader category of rate design. And rate design is one of those areas where things get sticky pretty quickly. Rate design also doesn't have a lot to do with what the proper size of the network should be, how centralized or how localized it should be. So rate design doesn't really have a lot of impact on the size of the network. As far as, you know, if you put solar grids on your, solar panels on your house, there's a microgrid, a teeny microgrid. And the PRC, I think, does have a role in promoting that more, because it can save investments in the infrastructure and in the long time save money for ratepayers, which is an important goal.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We've got one more full question, and then the last question, the 8th question, we're going to make it 1 minute each because I want to make sure we leave enough time for our listeners, and it's a question that would fit within that parameter. This one wouldn't. The legislature has attempted to pass a community solar bill in each of the last 2 sessions. It is likely to be reintroduced. When a community solar bill becomes law, it will be the PRC's responsibility to oversee that program. What do you see as the most important aspects of an effective community solar bill? And we'll start with you, Brian.
I think one of the most important aspects is reliability and safety. Building a 5 megawatt, a 10 megawatt solar farm is not a trivial undertaking. People can and have been killed or injured from interfacing with electrical infrastructure. So it's not something to be undertaken lightly. And because the community solar bill has failed twice now, I think we have a pretty good idea of where all the parties are coming from. And this is where we move away from the PRC's quasi-judicial role into their quasi-legislative role. The PRC should be sitting down with all the parties, asking the parties to talk to each other so they can come up with a bill to present to the legislature. One thing that the Roundhouse does well is set general broad policy parameters, but the real detail work needs to be done at the PRC. And that means creating a forum and creating a space where people feel comfortable talking about their desired outcomes in terms of policy and how to make community solar work. I love the idea of community solar. I think we need to see more and more of that. For example, in Santa Fe at the Chavez Center, we see this enormous array of solar panels. Not only does it supply cheap electricity to the center, but it's also a great place to park your car out of the sun in the summertime. So I think that's a really important goal for the PRC. And, you know, there's a lot of interests, competing interests with community solar. The PRC could do a better job of trying to reconcile these interests. And I think that's what one of their best goals would be.
Thank you. Joe, how do you feel?
Well, I just got an email before this conference call from PNM approving my interconnection for my solar panel installation on my single family home. But I think we all know full well that there are a lot of people out there that do not own single family homes. They're renters. They're struggling, their cost burden just to pay their rent. And I support the principles behind community solar. And that's making solar accessible and affordable to these folks that rent and don't have a lot of disposable income. But I realize there are issues like ownership, like reliability. And this is a very big question that I think tugs at the very foundation of the market that we're in, a traditionally regulated market where, you know, investor-owned utilities are vertically integrated. They're less likely to share ownership of these renewable energy projects. And so I think there's a bit of market reform involved here. But I think, look, we can look to our neighbor to the north in Colorado. Colorado has passed a Community Solar Garden Act, and they have had successive pieces of legislation that have articulated kind of the eligibility for community solar. And so, we do have some challenges in our market. We have to believe in the principles behind affordable and accessible solar for renters. And then lastly, we have a huge reminder in our neighbor to the north in the state of Colorado. What are they doing that New Mexico can't do? And so Brian's right, we need to work together with all the stakeholders and figure out what the underlying issues are and move forward.
Okay, thank you. Brian, I'm going to ask a follow-up question for both of you on this. And I'd like you to answer this question.
Wait a minute, don't I get a minute at the end of?
Yeah, well, this is the follow-up question. You're going to get a minute to answer the follow-up question. Yes. Do you feel that utilities should be able to own the community solar facilities that would be part of the community solar program? Why or why not?
I think, yes, I do think that utilities should have the ability to own infrastructure. I mean, the fact is, New Mexico is moving towards an all renewable future. This means that every New Mexican, regardless of their economic circumstances, is going to be able to partake and enjoy clean, green energy. And so the intermediate steps to get there, and community solar, I think, is an important part of that. The intermediate steps to get there are going to take a lot of detail. And so as a general standalone proposition in just a short time, I'm not going to say that any IOU, investor-owned utility, shouldn't own infrastructure. I think that's a very important aspect of it. But I think other people should be allowed, other entities should be allowed to own the infrastructure as well. That's all part of the energy democratization that needs to take place.
Thank you. And Joe, what about you? Should the utilities own community solar?
Well, I disagree. I don't think utilities should own community solar. It wouldn't be community solar if a utility company owns it. As a Santa Fe City Councilor, I worked behind the scenes with PNM. We were going to dedicate the land, the old closed landfill out at Buckman. And that was one of our initial sites that we were considering for community solar. We came to the table with a significant land donation. And unfortunately, PNM was unwilling to work with us. And so to me, it's not community solar if a utility company owns it.
Okay. All right. All right. So this last question from us, and then we're going to go to the questions from the audience. And 1 minute each. And this is 1 minute each. Okay. And there's no follow-up. So this is an easy one too. The legislature has passed a joint resolution calling for a ballot initiative that would give the governor the power to appoint commissioners instead of being elected. What is your position on this? What do you think is a good or bad? Why do you think this is a good or bad idea? And we'll start with Joe.
Well, I'm the great grandson of a constitutional delegate. His name was Jose Amado Lucero. And I think he's looking down wondering what is going on. Our state legislature is locked in this merry-go-round of piecemeal constitutional amendments. This joint resolution to amend the Constitution to make the PRC appointed is taking us back to 1941. We're kind of locked, we're going in circles here. I think it's a bad idea. I am against it. Utility rates are by and large lower in states that have elected regulators, utility regulators. Elected utility regulators are more accountable and accessible to voters. This amendment calls for downsizing the commission from 5 elected to 3 appointed. We could conceivably have 2 individuals controlling regulation throughout the state, and we may not know or have any input into their selection. And to me, that would be a travesty.
Okay, Ryan, your turn.
Well, putting aside the fact that if the constitutional amendment passes, we're out of a job in 2 years, that's fine. I I think it's a really difficult question. I mean, there's a constant ongoing conversation about how we govern ourselves. And I think that's healthy. And I think, you know, just to correct the historical record, it was in 1996 that we moved from the 3-person appointed to the elected commission we have now. It was also around that time frame that we started seeing some real cracks in our approach to regulation, and a lot of the scandals and arrests and you know, resignations that have happened since then. You know, I do have my own opinions on this, and I want to keep them to myself. I don't want to second guess the wisdom of any voter when they come to decide how they should be governed. It is one of the most fundamental questions about our democracy, and I want to respect the vote of the constituents.
Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a few questions over here, and we're going to take a second to just take a look at this. Here's one for you from Jay Levine. With the climate crisis, we know that getting to 100% renewables or close to it must happen as soon as possible. In Kit Carson territory, we think we can get to 80% renewables by 2025. The ETA suggests we do this by 2045, which is way too late for human survival. Do you support using the IRP process and other PRC processes to push for 100% by 2030? 2 minutes, and this is for Joe and then Brian.
Well, you know, look, it's a marker. I think we've already heard from P&M. They think that they can beat that goal of having carbon-free electricity by 2045. And the ETA set a little more relaxed thresholds for the co-ops. Now we need to make sure that it's affordable, that costs incurred are prudent and reasonable. So we need to make sure that the ratepayer is not overwhelmed with very high costs. But I do support beating those renewable portfolio standards. And I think Kit Carson is a model co-op. They've been very aggressive in getting out of the tri-state membership. They paid a pretty high price. But I think it's doable. And look, these costs are recoverable, but we need to make sure that we apply the law in that every rate that's demanded by any public utility is just and reasonable. And we need to make sure that service is reliable, adequate, efficient, and reasonable. So those principles are always going to prevail over trying to achieve these renewable portfolio standards set forth in the ETA.
Okay. Brian, your turn.
Well, I did start off this conversation by noting that I would like to accelerate the standards set forth in the ETA. And I mentioned Kit Carson as one of the exemplars of doing that. And so I think it's really important to understand that I accept the science of climate change. And I think that our flouting of the Paris Accords, our refusal to attempt carbon emission reductions is shameful. And so I want to push, I feel a sense of urgency about climate change. Just in my short lifetime, and I'm about the same age as my opponent, we've seen the same things. The winters have gotten shorter, the summers have gotten hotter, the snowpack has been reduced. So we need to get into a carbon-free network as soon as possible. And we need to do it not just with electricity, but with transportation. If we can achieve those two sectors, we've got 50% of carbon emissions eliminated. And we need to do that sooner rather than later.
So I'll do a follow-up to both of you because I still think that to some degree you have skirted the question. And so if you could just take 1 minute to just answer, would you support accelerating the process of getting to an RPI of 100% by 2025 or 2030?
Acronym alert. Could you explain your acronym, please?
The Renewable Portfolio Standard. It's from
The RPS.
Yes, in Kit Carson territory, they're going to get to 80% by 2025, and that's way faster. And so we're asking, would you support using the IRP process to get to 100% by 2030? And so maybe start your answer with a yes or no, and then
let
amplify.
us do 1 minute.
1
right?
minute each.
Okay.
First you, Brian.
Yeah. Yes, of course. I mean, I don't know how I can be any clearer. There's a range of processes available at the PRC. The IRP is just one of them. We can be bringing in other experts, outside expertise, such as from Sandia Labs, their battery division, to help us formulate policy and to spread that throughout the state to get more renewables on the grid. I've said it several times now, and I'm sorry I wasn't clear, but I do very strongly support accelerating as fast as possible the decarbonization of the grid. I don't know how I can be any clearer.
Okay. Go.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly support it, but the PRC, carries out the laws of the legislature, and now whether we want to go back to the legislature and call for even more aggressive renewable portfolio standards, that's another issue. But I think we can do things to really meet that goal. Is, as what I mentioned before, we have independent power producers that want to bring renewable energy to the market, but they can't connect to the grid. Organizations like Tri-State won't connect these independent power producers. So the market, if we can work toward a broader discussion about the nature of our market to decentralize it, deregulate it, and provide ratepayers more choices, I think we'll have a lot more renewable energy that can be delivered to the marketplace.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Here's a question from Wendy Volkman. As a Fortune 500 company, PNM's #1 goal is to attract and satisfy shareholders by making money. Will and how will PNM ever get behind renewables if they cannot make big profits, or as big a profits as they can on non-renewable energy? Their longer term plan relies on nuclear to meet the ETA's goal. Do you support nuclear energy as part of that package?
Who's first?
Joe's first,
And is this 1
and we'll
minute?
give you 1 minute.
Okay. Well, I think economic factors are taking over. The writing's on the wall, for example, that coal is it can't compete with renewable energy. And even PNM understands that. Right now, I believe PNM is using about 400 megawatts of power in their portfolio from Palo Verde. I see nuclear going by the wayside. I think market forces are gonna take effect again. We're gonna see people divesting their interest in nuclear. Renewables are the way to go. I think just the price and the market is so competitive that nuclear and coal just can't compete.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Ryan?
Brian, I think this is a real corporate governance question, because the question is premised correctly. Every corporation has a duty to maximize their profits, and this duty is legally enforced. And that duty comes at the expense of other interests that human beings have. Human beings have an interest in clean water, in clean air to breathe. And so I think we should look at the corporate governance structure of PNM. And if they include as profit maximization as their only goal, then we should really look at that and see if maybe their certificate of convenience and necessity, their authorization to operate in New Mexico, is being met. So there was 2 questions here. The second was about nuclear. There's no more new nuclear power plant that's going to be built. It's just not going to happen in America. It's happened in Russia recently, but America, it's not going to happen. So the question refers to Palo Verde. That's still supplying a lot of the base load that all New Mexicans need to function. and that is going to continue. It's not really a question of whether a commissioner supports it or not. The context we'll look at it in is how much should we pay for it? And I will do my best to make sure that we don't pay a cent more than we need to for that energy.
Okay, thank you. I had another question here. How likely do you see it that ratepayers will wind up being responsible for Palo Verde investments, nuclear investments? And we'll each give you one minute for this.
Could you repeat the question, please?
How likely is it that ratepayers will be responsible for Palo Verde nuclear investments and the decommissioning costs? Brian first.
I don't know the answer to that. I can't tell you where Palo Verde is in its life cycle. My understanding is that these power plants can last for up to 50 years, and that we're about 30 years into what's going on with Palo Verde. So we're going to need to start thinking about how we go about decommissioning it in a cost-effective way. But a term of years, I can't consider that.
Okay.
I mean, I just don't know the answer to that right now. I can get back to you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Joe?
Well, as my opponent mentioned earlier, in PRC District 3, PNM, I think covers only a fraction of PRC District 3. The rest is, includes service areas of co-ops. In terms of Palo Verde investments, ratepayers, I think, are already paying their share of the operational costs in the base rates for Palo Verde. But as my opponent mentioned, I think that, when they decommission that, what is PNM's proportional burden in terms of stranded costs? How will those costs be recovered, similar to San Juan Generating Station? And that remains to be seen. When it's decommissioned, how much undepreciated assets exist. So who knows? We'll have to see what the.
Uh-oh, we may have lost Joe there for a second.
We lost his video.
Oh, there, he's back.
Okay, sorry, I got an incoming call. Sorry.
Okay, well, and you are out of time. So I'm going to ask another question that didn't come from our viewers, our participants, but I will get back to them in just a second. But you were talking from that last question about, the corporation's charter is to maximize profit. And in that context, that compromises our ability to maybe deliver the kind of climate justice or environmental and economic justice we would like out of our energy generation. How do you feel about taking the utilities out of the private sector and creating a public utility instead of a private utility? First, Joe, 1 minute.
Well, as a Santa Fe City Councilor, in the first several months, I was a lead sponsor on a resolution to move a feasibility study of a city-county public power utility, and I had the support of the county. But in the end, it would have required acquiring PNM's infrastructure by eminent domain, and that was not a viable option. The only other option we had of creating a public utility is, as we grow as a city, that could be the first part of the public power utility, but we'd still need to rely on existing infrastructure from PNM. So I support public utilities. I believe it's possible, especially for home rule cities here in New Mexico. But it's the existing infrastructure, and acquiring it by eminent domain is just not something that's viable. But I do support public power.
Hey, Brian, your turn.
Yeah, I think that as market forces evolve with renewable energy, it would make a lot of sense to look at the distribution grid of the electric network, the transportation grid, and the generation. In telecommunications, they did something similar in the mid-90s, looking at the different portions of the network in which were amenable to competition and which weren't. So if you're going to talk about shifting PM's infrastructure to privately owned to publicly owned, you need to take a good hard look at that. It's a very difficult process, and there's a lot of unforeseen consequences. But I think it's an idea that should be closely examined, and if it has merit, we should continue to push it forward through legislation.
Okay. We have a question from Greg Sonnenfeld. I'm sure all PRC candidates are all familiar with the highly publicized 19-00195-UT San Juan replacement power case. What is your opinion of the request for proposal process that was used in that case and the resulting replacement power proposals resulting from that process? And we'll start with Joe, and then we'll go to Brian.
Okay.
Well, I guess
Oh, was it your turn, Brian? Sorry.
It doesn't really matter. Mr. Maestas is welcome to go first.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, the retirement of the San Juan power plant. You know, this is an ongoing case, and I want to be careful not to prejudice any parties. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to repeat the question because it was a little confusing to me.
the question basically was that through the San Juan replacement power case, there was a request for proposal process used to identify potential
right. The request for
power.
proposal.
And what was your opinion of that process?
Right, I think.
Start your 1 minute over. So go ahead.
I think that the process was probably flawed because there was some lack of transparency about how PNM chose the resources. I think there was some lack of transparency concerning which entities were involved. There is a rulemaking pending at the commission to reform the proposal process for this. And I worked closely with Cynthia Hall in drafting that rule, and we're accepting public comment on it now, and hopefully it will get released soon. But it was held up for several years by the current commission.
Okay, thank you. Joe, do you have a comment on the RFP process?
Yeah, I do. I believe the ETA required, in terms of the procurement of replacement resources for the San Juan generating station's capacity, to be competitive. And I think that based on the process that was actually carried out to procure replacement resources, it was hardly competitive in the way that we're familiar with the public procurement process. And so I am familiar with it. I think the process didn't meet the ETA test for a competitive procurement. I think it was more of a sole source. And so the underlying concern, right, is the ratepayer getting the best deal for the dollar, or is the ratepayer going to lose? And so I think that's an issue in this case. And I think that we need to enforce that ETA requirement, that the procurement process be competitive.
Okay, thank you, Joe. We have a question from Marielle Nanasi. We hardly ever see outside consultants or experts hired by the PRC. When the PRC has made those hires, the professionalism of PRC staff has increased tremendously. Can you please comment on the professionalism of PRC staff? Do you support hiring outside consultants? Why and why not? And we'll start with Joe, and then we'll go to Brian.
Well, you know, there's no doubt that, you know, the PRC is plagued with high vacancy rates, up to 20% of key technical positions. That is an issue. We need to fill those positions and get those vacancy rates down under 5%, number one. Number two, the PRC's expertise needs to be broadened to implement grid modernization legislation that was passed last year. I do favor, I think, first going to organizations like the Renewable Assistance Project, the RAP, it offers peer-to-peer support to regulators. There's the National Association of Regulation Commissioners. There's a lot of organizations out there that are providing technical assistance to regulators. So I think we need to bolster staff. I think we ought to seek the assistance of existing organizations that are designed to help regulation commissions, and then consider hiring outside consultants for highly specialized expertise.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Esther
Could I
Kovari.
address the question, please?
I'm sorry. Go, Brian.
I think outside expertise is absolutely essential because the industry is moving so fast that it's not reasonable to think that a career bureaucrat can keep up with it. In the 195 case that was mentioned earlier, there is staff testimony acknowledging that they hadn't bothered to read the rebuttal testimony of the other parties. So I'll let that stand as a comment on professionalism. I know that when Steve Fishman tried to bring in an expert from the Department of Energy, a nonpartisan and not affiliated with private interests on battery storage, he was shut down. He was shut down on that because the other commissioners were worried about outside influences. I think we need to be 180 degrees different. There is a lot of expertise that we can avail ourselves to, and I would like to see the PRC do that more.
Okay, thank you very much. We still have a question from Esther Kovari, and we'll start with Brian on this and then go to Joe. Based on Brian's point about P&M, does the PRC have the ability to rescind P&M's monopoly position if P&M doesn't meet certain requirements, such as considering public health and climate change in their deliberations?
Yes. The P&M, El Paso Electric, and Southwest all operate under something called a CCN. This is a Certificate of Convenience and Necessity. And it's what is given to the natural monopolies, which are, the IOUs, the investor-owned utilities, they're natural monopolies, and that's the reason why we regulate them. So through the CNN process, and the PRC has authority to revisit that at any time, if there are facts or circumstances that require us to look at how P&M is doing in meeting our electricity needs, the PRC, the Public Regulation Commission, has all the authority in the world to undertake that inquiry. And if that's necessary, then I would strongly support that and vote for it.
Okay, thank you. Joe?
Well, I think P&M is a monopoly. It's a consequence of our state being in a traditionally regulated market. Now, revisiting certificates of convenience and necessity, these pertain to power generation facilities. These pertain to transmission lines. That's very extreme, and to really reverse a CCN for facilities that are quite permanent and vital would be difficult. But I think there are other issues we need to look at, and it goes back to, I think, the underlying principles of rate making and service. By not having a decentralized market, we can't have competition, and so monopolies can do whatever they want because they're the sole provider of essential services. And as my opponent said, that's why they're subject to regulation.
Okay, thank you, Joe. We got one last question, 1 minute each, and we'll start with Brian this time. The question is, many constituents have found it hard to communicate with or visit their commissioner, as very often they are in the field or in meetings. Would you offer regular office hours, and what other means might you use to ensure good communication with constituents? Oh, Joe, go ahead, Joe.
You want me to go first?
Sure.
Look, I think that's where my experience is critical as an elected official and someone who understands government. Being accessible as an elected official is critical. And yes, I would have designated office hours. I'd also offer other opportunities to be accessible through email, or telephone. And let's face it, the District 3 commissioner, is probably closest to the PRC main building. And so there's got to be, I would also like to see the PRC hold more meetings outside of their facilities. Go out there in the field and go to the people instead of the people coming to you. This whole idea of having an office in a central location, I think should go by the wayside, given all the different means of communication. And so I understand the importance of accessibility, and I need to be accountable to the people that voted me in, and I need to be accountable to the ratepayers. So yes,
Okay.
I believe in accessibility.
All right, Brian?
Yes, my office hours would be 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, with special exceptions as required. I can tell you one of the most frustrating things when my last job at the PRC was taking call from constituents and having to explain to them that while they could write a letter or express their opinion about something, the PRC couldn't act on it unless it was sworn testimony. So I'd like to explore processes where we can hear from more constituents and we can hear about the impact of the PRC's decisions on them. I'd like to expand the process so that when 100 people show up to testify about what closing San Juan will mean to them, that there's a way to get that into a record in a more official way. Public comment like that right now doesn't count as testimony or evidence to support a decision. And I think we need to see that changed.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank both of you very much for taking the time to do this. We are at exactly 8 o'clock, and I hope that this format has worked for our attendees. And we asked a poll in the beginning of or in the middle of the survey of the event to see how we were doing. And we would encourage anyone who was on this call to write to retakeresponse@gmail.com and let us know what you thought. Did it work? How could we improve? We've got one coming up in another week with Stephanie Garcia Richard and Ari Biernoff from the Land Commission. And so with that, we're going to close the event. And again, thank you, Joe Maestas and Brian Harris. And the entire show has been recorded. We had indicated a bit into the beginning of this survey of the show forum that we hadn't started the recording on time, but our crackerjack Saraswati Khalsa, the other co-host on here, had turned it on right at the beginning, and so we're all good. So thank you all, and
Thank you.
be safe, stay healthy, and stay home.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, Joe, you want to say goodbye? And then Brian, we'll let you say goodbye.
Few seconds.
Okay, well, no, I'm just excited to be a candidate, and I humbly ask for the vote and support of folks out there on June 2nd.
Okay, thank you. Brian?
I'll just echo what Mr. Maestas said. Being a candidate, it's the first time I've done it. It is exhilarating and terrifying, and I want to thank everybody for giving me the chance to try to earn your trust.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good evening.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.